Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, we're excited to chat with you as the composer of our upcoming shows, Embedded and Telltale Cell Phone. So we have lots to talk about with those shows in particular, and then also just in general, some things on composing operas. I guess just right off the bat, if you had to describe Embedded in one sentence, especially for maybe someone that's just going to be scrolling, how do we get them to stop, and what would you say?
Embedded is a retelling of a Edgar Allan Poe short story, but for today. So it's creepy, it's dramatic, it's funny, and it'll probably make you feel a whole lot of things.
Great. And what about the same for Telltale Cell Phone?
Telltale Cell Phone is a really stupid take on Edgar Allan Poe, really funny, and there's opera jokes if you're into opera. There's funny, ridiculous scenarios if you're not into opera, but it's kind of meant as a farcical take on the Telltale Heart, which everyone's read. And this is sort of a quirky opera retelling of it, but with the cell phone as you know, the thing. So it's funny. It's a great way to get into opera if you're not into it, and if you are into opera, I think you'll have a great time with it.
So, have you always been a big fan of Poe?
Not necessarily. Of course, read him in high school, like you're supposed to, and everything like that. But I did this opera program, the Composer Librettist Development Program here in New York at American Lyric Theater was putting on, and they commissioned three one-act Poe operas to celebrate his 200th anniversary. So we all were given the task of choosing a short story of Poe's, and our librettist would then retell that as a contemporary story. So originally it was three one acts put together for a full evening, and and then my librettist Deborah Brevoort settled on the Cask of the Amontillado as the Poe story, and ironically, so that was happening, and then ironically I'd been doing 10-minute comic operas every year at Carnegie Hall. A friend of mine was kind of producing a 10-minute opera thing every year. And so every year I was coming up with a new one. I was like, hey, wouldn't it be funny to do like a silly Poe opera to counter the serious dramatic Poe opera? And kind of came up with this idea of the Telltale Cell Phone, kind of riffing off of Telltale Heart. So it was just like this coincidence of this, span of time doing a couple of Poe themed operas.
Yeah, okay, cool. That's good to know. And then also good for everyone to kind of hear that Telltale Cell Phone is a little bit funnier because then when they come to see it,
Oh
that's
yeah.
how the show ends, right? So you can kind of end on a
Yeah.
little bit of a lighter note than Embedded.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we were talking about doing this, the idea of pairing them together is kind of fascinating because, like, what order do you put it in? Do you put the comedy first? Do you put the drama first? But I like the way we're doing it. I think it's going to be a palate cleanser after big dramatic, opera, and then doing kind of a Q&A afterwards. I think will be interesting because opera can be a lot of things. It doesn't just have to be drama and angst. It can be silly and you know, and I think this is a really good showcase for that, and kind of unusual to have a company present like the same voice or same composer, but on kind of opposite ends. I think that's actually really cool, and I'm pretty thankful for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what are some through lines? You talked about how we are putting the two of them, one's more dramatic, one's more comedic, but are there some themes that are similar across both shows?
Well, I guess so. Poe is often there's deception going on, someone trying to deceive someone else or trick someone else into something. So that's definitely there. I mean, obviously one's very dramatic and the other one's kind of silly, but there's a bit of a mystery. I mean, like if you think about it, Edgar Allan Poe invented the like Sherlock Holmes mystery idea, right? He sort of like was the first person to do that deductive reasoning kind of thing. So Dupin, who was his Sherlock Holmes, which what Sherlock Holmes was based on, comes from this idea of Poe, with this kind of like dramatic deductive detective kind of thing going on. So there's a little bit of that in there. especially in Telltale cell phone. But it's and then there's drama. There's one's serious and one's not.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So also earlier you mentioned working with your librettist for embedded. So, here at Charlottesville Opera, we always think that opera is for everyone, and we have a lot of content to help educate people about opera if they are total newbies and they might
Mhm.
not know anything. And so can you kind of share the relationship between the composer and the librettist and then for you in particular, how that plays out as you work to create new work?
Sure. Yeah, I mean the operas are really put together in a way kind of like the way musical theaters are. Musical theater, you have a composer and someone writes the book and there's the lyricist. So that tradition comes out of opera where so you generally had one person doing the words and somebody else doing the music. And here it's interesting because the with embedded, I've been working with Deborah Bevort, my librettist, in this program for a couple of years, and we had done a bunch of shorter pieces together. And she's like an amazing writer. She teaches musical theater writing at NYU. She's a very accomplished playwright, and she was really interested in opera, even though she had never done it before. And so the program kind of helped bring us together and got us thinking in different ways. And I think she really did a fantastic job with the retelling uh, of the Casca di Amontillado and turning it into embedded and making it very contemporary in that way. Because I always like it when someone will go somewhere that I wouldn't have thought of, and she really did. And it's interesting because the subject matter gets pretty intense at the end, and and that was a little challenging, I think, for me as a native New Yorker and everything. But it definitely is I think kind of one of opera's jobs is to make you feel things and to kind of go in a little deeper. And then with the comedy, I think that was more just kind of having fun with how do we retell this story uh, and make it so anyone can enjoy it. Like I definitely feel very strongly that opera should be for everybody. So I love that that's your mission. And I think with embedded, my hope is that you get excited by the characters. Like you're at a certain point, you're not sure who the good guy and the bad guy is, even though it's obvious. At a certain point, there is it gets a little bit blurry, and I think my hope is that you get into the psychology of the characters, and that helps you go through this journey in this through the story to however it ends. And like with a comedy, it's different. It's about timing, and it's also trying to make that accessible. A lot of the Temin operas that I've written were meant as vehicles for that to kind of be put out, in non-operatic settings.
And back to the question of how does a composer and a librettist work together for an
Mhm.
opera? Just like even on a more basic level,
Mhm.
like for those who aren't even familiar with how musical theater is written, like who does do you all work in lockstep? Does one person do you can create the music and they create the words later or how so can if you can describe like even
Sure.
just really hands-on like simple like what does that look like?
Yeah, generally I like to kind of have the story in place first, like the libretto written out. Libretto is kind of like a script. It sort of tells you what's happening. It has the actual spoken words plus description, things like that. So in both cases, the libretto was written first, and then like a lot of things, you sort of at a certain point get started with it, and then once you're kind of working on it, you start to realize like, oh, maybe tweak words here and there. So with embedded, um, Deborah and I would just kind of go back and forth. And because sometimes you're like, I've got this really cool melody, but it's, you know, um, you've got 3 syllables and I really need 2 syllables, so it's like, and then I would send that to her and she might send back an alternate version or something like that. And that's that happens a lot with the libretto composer dynamic. Um, because a lot of time, I mean, I feel like you're discovering the piece as you're writing it. So you can't be, too strict with a libretto, or because you don't know exactly, you haven't met the piece yet. Like I think the music starts to really inform things at a certain point. And with Telltale Cell Phone, that was more just like, as I was like, we kind of came up with a scenario, and then because we were just kind of writing it in the moment. Also, that was a much quicker kind of process, to kind of figure it out and figure out what would be the silliest thing to put in certain situations, and you know,
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. So in both of these shows, but maybe more so embedded, um, is there a lesson that audiences should walk away with, or is there, is this some sort of commentary on something bigger in
mm.
modern life?
Ooh, yeah. It would be really interesting. I think Deborah's going to be able to come down for the panel discussion, and she, because she's really wonderful, and will have a lot to say about all that. But the so Embedded is based on this Edgar Allan Poe story, Cask of the Amontillado, where this guy is trying to get revenge on his enemy. So that's the premise. But what Deborah did is that she, the story is about this, really famous news reporter who, is a woman who's getting older, and she's starting to get aged out of her job by a younger reporter. And in the context of that sort of like situation, this very significant, dramatic thing happens that she has to figure out if she should do it or not. But she knows that it's maybe not the most ethical, and she might put herself in danger, but she feels like it could advance her career at this point where she's getting worried about being replaced. So that speaks, I think, in a pretty large context to, I mean, a lot of different issues, like not just ageism, but just, taking a risk, or like, getting ahead of yourself, hoping for glory and fame, but maybe not realizing the other person's ulterior motives.
Hmm.
In this case, the person trying to get revenge has some pretty strong ulterior motives. Um, and so, what I really like what Deborah did in libretto is sort of have this subtext built into this Poe story, which is kind of like a revenge, horror type of thing. And that's the other thing with Poe, is that he also kind of invented the horror genre in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and there is some of that in there for sure, and so I think that makes it, relevant, and it's going to be kind of personal, especially if you relate to some of these characters. And I think the way it's written, you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people can relate to the idea of should you do something risky to advance your career or your situation or not. So,
Yeah, I mean, there's a beautiful aria, that Carolyn, or our reporter sings, where she's kind of lamenting getting older, and it's what she sings right before the inciting incident, where she realizes she has to make a choice, right? So there's the subtext is this ageism issue with this very risky situation, and I really like how Deborah wrote that. It really packs a lot in.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then so obviously these are part of Charlottesville Opera's Wallace Works initiative that we do every year to highlight new works. So, if you could speak to the importance of new opera works and why you think that's important that they keep getting made and then that they keep getting performed.
Yeah, I mean, I think opera is kind of a funny thing, because it's got this, people think of it in a particular way, right? Oh, it's this old, big, dramatic thing, and but it when it's done right, it really communicates, and it's really a powerful theatrical experience. And hearing somebody singing without amplification, just with an orchestra, is pretty spectacular. And um, I think for a long time, opera in this country wasn't going anywhere. It was all about stuff from Europe, old stuff from Europe. And that really started changing in the last, I'd say, 20 years. There's been a big movement to change that because, opera was kind of dying. Opera audiences were getting older and there weren't that many young people, but there was a real initiative, I think, seeing what was happening in musical theater, where it was exploding. And, TV shows, reality shows with dancing and singing and performances and things like that. And I think there was an insecurity in America about singing in English because if it's real opera, it's in a European language. And and I think that stigma has shifted. And what was interesting is I think the pandemic really was a turning point in a lot of ways. Like there were things percolating for a few years before that, but then I think when the Metropolitan Opera House came back from pandemic, their first season at the last minute, they decided to put in a Terence Blanchard opera, A Fire Shot My Bones. Now, Terence Blanchard is famous for writing all the music for Spike Lee,
Mhm.
right? And he also has a career writing concert music and things like that. So the Met took this huge risk of putting a contemporary opera on their main stage for the opening after years of not being open because of the pandemic.
Mhm.
And um, they hadn't done that I think they've only done that like once or twice before, and it never went so well.
Mhm.
And what happened, I think, surprised everyone is that it was sold out. It was a very diverse audience, very diverse demographic. It was the first, I think, it was first premiere of African American composer in a long time. And they had done like the Malcolm X opera like
Mhm.
a while ago, but this was a thing. Like people came out for it, and it completely changed how the large opera company in the country started presenting
Mhm.
because what they very quickly changed their programming and they started outselling their traditional operas, which is crazy. But what's interesting is that like Fort Worth Opera had been discovering that about 5, 6 years earlier, where their contemporary operas were starting to really talk to their audiences. The programming was really like what they were programming and how they were doing it, and how they were marketing it, and people got interested, and so it is really important having like you can't get better at opera unless you do opera as a composer or librettist or as a singer or and at a certain point, challenging yourself to do new things is difficult, but it's really rewarding, and I think it's really necessary because now the art form is growing. Like now the Met has 2 or 3 premieres every year, and it's changed opera in America, and now there's all this work that's happening, and it's a really exciting time to be here. And 40, 50 years ago that would have been unheard of.
Yeah.
And so I think what Charlottesville's doing is significant. It's a lot, like it's like with Fort Worth, like kind of these like regional opera houses that figured out how to bring programming to their audiences and find that mix between standard rep and new rep. And the new rep is bringing in younger people and different people, and that's really important to keep it growing as a I think it's a smart business decision and a smart programming decision.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't even know a lot of that history of like a lot of that really just taking off post
Yeah.
pandemic. That's really great. Jess, do you have any questions?
I really have an out of the box question. It's
Ooh,
just maybe
fun.
not a linear question based on what we've been talking about.
And none of my
Um,
answers are linear anyway, so it's
that's
fine.
that's okay. So, I'm interested in learning a little bit more about like so when you're composing something, um, you say you typically like to have the libretto first. How do you go about finding the sound for a show without it feeling right? Because obviously
Mm.
opera has a huge canon. There's a certain way that people like opera to sound. Is there a way that you feel like you go about that so that you feel like it's something fresh and new without being too unfamiliar?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really hard question because that's the challenge of writing anything. It doesn't matter if it's opera or a book or a theater or whatever. It's or a film, it's just like how do you have your own voice come across? Um, I find starting in the middle, right? Because I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know the voice yet. I don't know, the musical language and all those little things are going to be yet. Like it's like I just met you. We're just starting a conversation, right? So I'll start with like I also do this with when I write ballet as well. You sort of start. I try and find the least important scene, like the most benign, not particularly interesting, like, and just start there. It's a low risk, easy in because it's intimidating, right? You don't know. Like, of course you're thinking about these things. What's this going to be? And it's and as I've been revising, even embedded over the last few months, kind of trying to remember some of that process when I originally wrote it for the original production. And there's a lot there, but it didn't start that way. So I think a lot of it's just, starting with something that's kind of simple and then it just sort of grows a little bit. Like, you start with that little, maybe a little scene and you start to kind of figure some things out. And then like for me, like, start coming little motives here and there. And then they start to kind of feel like, oh yeah, this feels like part of this. And then it kind of grows. It's sort of like, uh, an additive process where it slowly starts to take shape and then you move forward and then you realize things and you go back and and it just kind of it's exciting and challenging and frustrating and wonderful. But at least the way that I work is I try and let it tell me what it needs and try and let that creative flow happen. And at a certain point, it's almost like it's like you just kind of go, you just fly. It's like it's just you kind of tapped into whatever is going on and you are able to just go. You know what it needs, you know what direction it needs to go, and it's pretty incredible. But it takes a while to get there.
Well, that was a nice. I mean, yes, I always find it interesting that we talk a lot about like how we explain how op. Hold on, let me get my sentence together. I started in the middle of the sentence instead of the beginning. I've been thinking a lot about how we talk a lot about opera and like I do a lot of our like written word stuff. So I'm writing a lot about opera, but obviously opera is music, right? And so it's so strange to me that we spend so much time trying to describe something that already has its own language. Like like I mean, yeah. When you're talking about writing a book, obviously, you're taking people who are really literate and are who are versed in writing prose, right? But you're doing stuff that's like music has its own language and is I feel like we should spend more time. Not that your answer wasn't fantastic, it was great. But I feel like it's hard to try and pin down um what is happening musically because we're not, sitting here writing
Yeah.
music. We're talking.
Well, I mean, like opera is theater. Theater is experiential. You have to be there to experience it,
Mhm.
right? Or you have to listen to it or watch it or something like that. But you have to be part of that to experience it. And that's I think it's very easy to talk about the history of opera and this, that, and why you should like it and blah blah blah. But I think like going back to your earlier question about the 10-minute operas, I think what Charlottesville Opera and a bunch of other companies realize that these 10-minute operas are a great way to let people experience it in a very low risk approach. Like, you know what, if you don't like it, it'll be over in 9 minutes. But it's it's experiential. So most of the time people kind of get into it, right? Like if you're there, if you've invested the time to go to the theater or to like, if the performance is at a bar or something like that and you're having a drink, and it's happening, who knows, you're experiencing something. And I think that's really important. I mean, the combination of like talking about it in the history, but also it's theater. You have to experience it. And so I think which you're doing with bringing the young artists to perform like the short operas is exactly what it needs to be. Get people to experience it.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I know we're over time, so just thank you again for your time.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I think this was going to be a really interesting conversation for people to listen
Yeah.
to. So thank you.
Hey, all right. Take care.
All right, bye.
Bye.